don't trust the cloud. And it's good. It looks like we are live. Well, welcome everybody to the Into the Impossible podcast. And this week I'm joined by a very special guest, which is Darren Lipomi, who's a professor of nanoengineering. Is that the actual title?
That's the title. That's the name of the department. Also chemical engineering, but I'm a trained chemist, so we cover a lot of bases.
Yeah, I thought it'd be like a whole bunch of Smurf-sized engineers running around there, but we'll get into what it actually means to be a nano engineer in just a bit. I want to read Darren's bio here. And let's start, if I can find it here. I believe I deleted it. Yep, there it is. So Darren and I actually met, through a strange series of events that seems like a distant memory, but it was really only supposed to take place a few months ago, which is the Kyoto Prize ceremony in San Diego. That was to take place, takes place annually, or has for the last couple of decades, both in Kyoto, Japan, and in San Diego, of all places, because I think Kyocera Corporation has their US headquarters here in San Diego. And they've given out awards for 20 or 30 years in the sciences, in the technology, branches of technology and engineering, and also in the arts. And it's a wonderful organization I've been involved with tangentially for several years. But Darren and I were paired as hosts, sort of caretakers. I don't know, fixers is the right word, Darren. I'm not sure how to say it, but we were hosting the three laureates this year in the sciences. It was Professor Jim Gunn of Princeton University, and Darren was to host.
Cheng W. Tong.
Cheng W. Tong, yeah. So we'll talk a little bit, perhaps, if we have time. But let me just first introduce Darren. Darren earned his undergraduate degree in chemistry from Boston University and his Ph.D. from the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Harvard University in June 2010. At Harvard, he worked in the laboratory of Professor George Whitesides in the areas of materials chemistry, nanofabrication, including soft lithography, and nanoskiving, which I don't know what that means.
But nanoskiving has a bit of a funny etymology, but we can get into that or not.
Do those have any relation to Perscovites or things of that nature?
No,
okay.
but skiving itself is a British English word that means slacking off. So we came up with the word and then published it before realizing that it was, nanoskiving was slacking off in a very small way.
He was also a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University in chemical engineering. He has a very interesting fork in his career, at least, or partially, in one branch of his wave function. He earned a certificate, a so-called mini MBA from Stanford University Graduate School of Business. I think that's quite spectacular. Hopefully we can get into that. It's now called Stanford Ignite. And he joined UCSD in 2012 as a professor in the Department of Nanoengineering, which is part of the Jacobs School of Engineering. And today, in honor, I couldn't find any UCSD shirts to wear in my hamper. I didn't want to pull one out, so I pulled out a Padres jersey in honor of the fact that maybe this will come out soon when the Padres season is set to resume. And as I always say, even in a COVID-shortened season, I like to wear it and support them in the first week of the season before they're mathematically eliminated. And so far, that's brought me good luck. Anyway, Darren, lengthy introduction to a very impressive, I won't say young man, because you're so accomplished. I'll just say it's very impressive to have you as a colleague and as a friend, and have you as a guest on the Into the Impossible podcast. Today, we're going to talk about your podcast, though. So tell us a little bit more, if you like, about some of the stuff you do outside of your phenomenal teaching and coursework that you put online on your YouTube channel, Darren Lipomi. I believe that's your YouTube handle. Mm-hmm. Tell us what else you're up to these days in this era of COVID.
So moving into the digital presentation space was always something that I was interested in. When I was a little kid, I got it's called a Fisher-Price PXL 2000 video camera, which shot about 11 minutes of a black and white video per side of an audio tape. So very high data rate. That's why you couldn't get very much on there. But we didn't have the money for a standalone VHS recorder, so this is what I used. And then various iterations of VHS compact camcorders later. I basically just made my stuffed animals act out scenes from Star Wars, and then we had a TV show that I produced called Yummy Trek, which was a parody of Star Trek, and that kind of got me through high school, and then I kind of abandoned the performance sort of aspect of nerdiness for a while until I developed all of this coursework, and I wanted to put it online. And there were a few reasons that I wanted to put it online, one of which is to sort of engage with the active learning or flipped classroom methodology of teaching. And what that allowed me to do was to assign lectures as pre-recorded material and then sort of transform the class period into a variety hour where we would do design problems and questions and group activities and modern applications of the material. Around the same time, this is 2017, I was asked to organize a discussion series for grad students and postdocs in the engineering school on professional development. And I was very excited to take on this role because it got me, through it, I was able to make connections with people in industry and other, and law and other aspects of the business and professional world to bring them in and give talks to the students. However, there were a lot of topics for which I couldn't find speakers, and I ended up giving those talks myself. And because I was doing the recording, I bought all this recording equipment for teaching. I ended up recording all of those, and I ended up with about...
Pixel? You didn't have the Pixel still?
No, it's a, so many people have asked me for the recording equipment, and I just send them my Amazon order page, but it's a not quite pro model 4K camera. And so I ended up with about 20 of these lectures, and they took an enormous amount of time to prepare the slides and what I was going to say and how I was going to respond to questions. So I put all of those on YouTube as well, and some of those are some of my most, more popular than the course content. And I was also getting requests for audio versions. It kind of made me feel bad at first because I spent all this time making the visuals and the slides, but it turns out if you close your eyes, it's basically the same, information that's on the screen just coming out of my mouth. So actually, just a few weeks ago, I started a podcast where I was at first just taking the audio versions of some of these talks and putting them on the podcast. And since then, I've started to make some new content and then sort of have a cross-pollination between the YouTube channel and the podcast. The podcast is called Molecular Podcasting with Darren Lipomi.
Yeah, so many things to talk about. First, do you feel like the lectures, the kind of non-scientific but incredibly vital for the actual successful ship or whatever Homer Simpson would call it, is added to your teaching abilities? Has it augmented them? Is it a complement? Is it something that anybody can do, or something unique because you have this passion since, by your own admission, since you were a kid, you love to be on camera?
I think recording the videos about professional topics has made me consider aspects of professionalism, how ideas are generated, how to write effectively, that maybe in my everyday life as an academic, I wouldn't really have a reason to be self-reflective about these things. So it really takes a good, couple of days of quite intensive study and not quite meditation on these topics to develop an appreciation for how to convey them to others, and how in the process how to convey them to yourself, and how to incorporate some of the tips and tricks into your own work. I think anybody anybody could do it. I think that there are, it takes a certain amount of comfort with exposure, maybe, that putting all of your materials and even quite personal thoughts online for everybody to see, it takes some of that. So I think everyone could do it. I don't think everyone is inclined to do it.
How'd you come up with the name Molecular Podcasting and the cover artwork for the podcast?
So the cover artwork is a molecular dynamics simulation by one of my former students, Sam Root, who's now a postdoc at Harvard. He has credit in my podcast description. The name Molecular Podcasting came from really two sources. One, I'm a chemist, and I feel a strong affinity to chemistry and molecules, and there aren't, compared to your own field and biology, there aren't that many high profile chemists doing outreach work. And I'm not going to call myself high profile, but I am doing outreach work. And there is a lot of outreach in the chemical community. I don't want to offend anybody, but what I really mean is there's no equivalent of a Carl Sagan. Not to compare myself to Carl Sagan, I think you know what I'm saying. In chemistry, I think that it's because I don't quite know why this is. Peter Atkins, the physical chemist, tried to do some of this with his book, The Second Law, but it probably honestly never really caught on. So that's one reason. Another is that molecular, in terms of, mechanics, we think about continuum mechanics versus molecular mechanics. Molecular mechanics, very small, nano-sized objects that are kind of, the word molecular might be associated with the nitty-gritty and nuts and bolts of how things actually get done. And I think that's what differentiates my popularization or my strategy toward popularization compared to maybe some other active scientists, and that I'm really talking about how does the science get done, kind of on the proverbial molecular scale.
At that granularity level, yeah. And actually, I was introduced to science. My first inspiration as a popular science author was Isaac Asimov, not his science fiction books, which I haven't read, embarrassingly enough, for a person who hosts a podcast called Into the Impossible, based on Arthur C. Clarke's famous phrases, which we'll get into. I want to ask you the 3 questions I ask all my guests towards the very end of our conversation. But Isaac Asimov's books on science nonfiction, chemistry, atoms, the history of chemistry, I couldn't get enough of them. And that was sort of as a 10 or 12-year-old. Take us through your world line, as we physicists say. You obviously, I know your academic pedigree. I'm sorry you went to such subpar institutions, all the way from undergrad to graduate. Where'd you grow up? What got you into chemistry? What got you into the nano world? And where is your specific research going? And what fascinates you about this underworld?
Sure, that's it's sort of the parallel track to the schools and the degrees. First, a little side note about Isaac Asimov. He was actually a professor at my alma mater, Boston University.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he taught biochemistry at
Wow.
one point when he became a famous writer, and he lost his, or he gave up or lost or whatever his permanent position. He actually gave 1 lecture a year, and one of my roommates who had whose father is a dentist had him for a pre-med dental biochemistry class. So anyway, nice connection there. And okay, so actually I'll go back. Isaac Asimov is an example of a trained chemist who is a popularizer. Okay. So I grew up in Western New York State in a town called Hilton, about 20 miles northwest of Rochester. And I got into, it's hard to pinpoint the moment I got into science. I can tell you the exact date that I got into like Star Trek, because I was watching this, late night TV on the Fox affiliate that would run the reruns. And we just got our 486 family computer in 1993. And I know the date that I started watching Star Trek because my sisters kicked me off of the computer. And when you booted up the computer and they said that the date that the BIOS was set and everything was October 10th, 1993. So that's the day that I watched episode 29, Operation Annihilate, where Spock has this fried egg land on his back that injects some tentacles into his body, and then he becomes blind, and so on. So that's the episode, that's the particular moment. Star Trek was hugely influential on me. Star Wars before that, although it doesn't quite have the same intellectualism in terms of myth and exposing a young kid to space flight and warp speed and so on, and bioneural gel packs and things that I'm thinking about now, and haptics and holodecks and stuff. That's there. For a while, I thought I wanted to go into medicine, so I really enjoyed this show on the Learning Channel when we were kind of given an illicit cable subscription at some point, called Trauma, Life in the ER. And I really liked the idea of trauma surgery. I liked the intensity of it, or I thought I did. I applied fairly broadly. I'm actually skipping a major part, and that's my interest in music, particularly the piano and the trombone. I was a band geek in high school. I applied to music school at Eastman and Northwestern for trombone, kind of the two of the best brass schools, but I didn't get in. And no offense to any of my former music classmates, I did not want to teach, though. I wanted to be on stage in an orchestra or an opera pit. And that's what I wanted to do, but I didn't get into any of the schools that I wanted to for music. However, all of those places, I also applied as a double major to engineering. And I didn't really know what engineering was. My favorite subject in high school was chemistry, so I chose chemical engineering. Turns out that chemical engineering has basically nothing to do with chemistry, because it's basically all continuum stuff. I can just hear people yelling at their earbuds right now. But chemical engineering is intellectually much more similar to mechanical engineering than it is to chemistry. Whereas it's fluid mechanics as opposed to solid mechanics, if you take it to sort of a first approximation. If a school didn't have a chemical engineering program, I applied to biomedical engineering or bioengineering, and for no other reason but that it sounded cool and it had like the most syllables. So at Boston University, I was a biomedical engineering major for a couple of weeks, but my second year of undergrad, 9/11 happened, and it made me very, skeptical or uninterested or actually disinterested for a time in technology and the way and becoming part of some technological machine. And so I just
sorry to interrupt, but you mean because it might have some potential application towards defense or warfare? Is that what you mean? Because
it felt. Let me rephrase. I think it's because it felt too dry and not human facing.
Right, not nourishing of the human side. Okay, I get it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I switched my major to anthropology, and
that's pretty radical. I switched from physics to mechanical engineering to astronomy to physics. So that was.
So we'll get narrow, but at first, it's like the Fourier transform. We gotta narrow it down here. So we went to I switched to biological anthropology because I was very interested in behavioral biology and evolution and things like that. I had a fantastic, I read a fantastic book in my Introduction to Biological Anthropology course called Lucy's Legacy by the primatologist Alison Jolly. And in this book, the author has since passed away, but she referenced an author named E.O. Wilson several times. And E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, a famous professor at Harvard and curator of the American, or the Harvard Museum of Natural History, wrote the book Sociobiology, which was, along with a couple of other books in the early 70s, including The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, sort of introduced the idea of this, I don't know, maybe it's not introduced, but popularized this idea of the deep connection between molecular evolution and biological adaptation, and then social behavior in animals. And the last chapter in sociobiology was where he daringly applied the concepts of sociobiology to human behavior, and that was hugely controversial. And there was this period of time where he was kind of ostracized by the academic left, famously other people at Harvard like Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould. And so anyway, he wrote a follow-up book called On Human Nature, where he sort of doubled down. And then later on in his writing career, he wrote a book called Consilience, which is about the unity of knowledge. And the central theme of the book is the deep connectivity between all branches of learning. So really the only reason that that chemistry and physics and biology are considered even different disciplines is because of historical accidents. You know, where does physical chemistry end and chemical physics begin? It's probably a fuzzy boundary at best. Maybe it's even a counterproductive boundary. And if you look all the way up through levels of organization in science and human learning, you go from biology to neuroscience to psychology to economics or sociology, and at which point do the boundaries actually make sense? And one could argue that because it's all historical accidents, I mean, the reason that chemical engineering departments exist is because we're trying to process chemicals on a large scale, largely due to the needs of the petroleum industry. But you know, it's very rare to find research in a chemical engineering department that could not be happening in a physics department or a chemistry department, or even even in some cases a biology department. So there's so much intermixing that once I was an undergraduate, I wanted to find a way to combine these interests. And I've taken quite a garden path here. Thank you for your for your patience. So this was biological anthropology. That was my major, but I had an excellent teacher in chemistry 102, John Straub, who's a physical chemist, sort of a protein dynamicist. And he took a lot of time one summer when I was cleaning toilets for the Office of Conference Services at BU, and I listened to my CD Walkman, and then on my lunch breaks I would read these books by Gould and Wilson and Allison Jolly and whoever I could get my hands on. And he and I started to develop this idea of an independent concentration, where I could take whatever I wanted and then do some sort of senior thesis at the end. What I eventually ended up doing, though, was taking a little bit more of a conventional route. I changed my major to biochemistry, and then to straight up chemistry, and then added a minor in physics, and then said, okay, we're not going to spend a lot of intellectual resources on this independent concentration. I'm just going to do that stuff on the side and get a traditional degree. So around that time, I got a fellowship from the Beckman Scholars program, which provided summer funding for 2 consecutive summers in 1 academic year. And I got to pick any professor's lab. So I chose Jim Panic, who was doing natural product total synthesis. So this is where a molecule is isolated, in this case, from a bacterium that lives in a sea sponge off the coast of Papua New Guinea that had biological activity against very dangerous fungal infections that occur in HIV/AIDS patients, as well as patients on chemotherapy. And so there wasn't a route to a lot of this material. They only recovered, less than 1 milligram from the sponge. So there's a lot of value in developing a synthetic route to come up with more of this material. So with my graduate student mentor Neil Langell and we made the compounds. I think I can do the rest in like less than a minute.
Okay.
And I went to grad school originally to continue my interest in organic chemistry, but I found that I was kind of burned out on the topic, quite honestly, and I ended up joining George Whitesides' group because at the time he had a project on the chemical origins of life. So how do you get energy dissipating, self-replicating systems in abiotic conditions? That project didn't really go anywhere. Instead, there was this other project based on unconventional nanofabrication of various structures. Really, it has everything to do with the postdocs who were hired at the same time as I came on, and a grad student, Emily Weiss, Ryan Checky, and Michael Dickey, who took me under their wing, and I learned really their craft from them. Then when I did a postdoc at Stanford, it was to combine my interests in organic chemistry with material science, and that's where I started to work on stretchable bio-inspired electronics and devices. Then when I started at UCSD, the idea was to combine literally all of my interests in building molecules from the ground up for applications in devices that interface with biological systems.
Mm. All right, that was quite a peregrination, but
my apologies.
but very intriguing. It's too bad you and I both are, New Yorkers, and so we speak pretty quickly. So even at 2x multiplier on the YouTube or on the iPod, you will still be able to cut it down. But
astute users will find the half speed as well.
That's right. I like to alternate between half and double speed just to keep my brain active. You mentioned a lot. It's clear to me we're going to have another conversation about specifics. Maybe we'll have a separate conversation about these academic issues. I'll just say one thing, that it's clear, as Søren Kierkegaard said, life must be lived forwards, but it can only be understood looking backwards. And now I do have an understanding of why you are, sort of uniquely able to fuse the very hard technical, very scientific aspects of cutting edge research and pedagogy, as you do in your academic playlist, so to speak, with this kind of, I always forget, is it your left brain, right brain? I forget. The other side of the brain, which deals with the so-called soft or interpersonal attributes of the human intellect, and that simultaneously through you, they can both find a safe purchase. And that is a testimony to the work that you presumably put in one of your many undergraduate majors and your curiosity. I picked up a lot of things there that you're an avid reader. I think that you're extremely curious intellectually, and that your curiosity isn't just restricted, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but we both know people that only focus on what they do, and they could be tops in the field of what they do, but in terms of a more broader panorama of the big picture of science, the background that you've outlined seems to very naturally suit you to be in a position to communicate these vital lessons to our students. And some of those lessons are really never taught. One of your lectures, I think it's a good title. Maybe you should use it for your book, but it's called How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Already the title of a very popular book.
Oh, too bad. So sad. Yeah. But that in that lecture, you give an overview of how people perceive the role and the place of a scientist and the way that, or an engineer, and how he or she should orchestrate their balance between technical ability and interpersonal abilities. And those can include networking, public speaking, listening skills, communication skills. And versus the pure technical skills, which seem a lot easier and seem a lot more important. But most scientists and engineers believe that that is the number one thing, is to be technically competent. In reality, it's, as you present in a wonderful pie chart, I believe, is the exact complement of that structure. In other words, it's basically 2/3 or maybe 3-to-1 ratio between the interpersonal skills and networking, et cetera, to technical skills. Now, what do you make of that? I have a certain theory about that, but I want to segue into academia right now by asking you that. Why do you think that A, the perception is exactly inverted, and B, why do you think it is that to be a successful engineer, it really benefits you to work on things outside of chemical engineering? I mean, if you had to put a bet, it would sort of place most of your tokens on the soft skills, so to speak.
It's very interesting. There's an idea, I think, perpetuated by caricatures like Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, or Martin Prince from The Simpsons, that these uber intellectuals, are the scientists and are the scientific leaders. I would say that the scientific leader is not necessarily always, in fact, in my experience, rarely the smartest person in the room on kind of a raw intellectual horsepower, however you want to say that. I have students who can do so much more than I can, with a theory or building a computational algorithm to calculate some property. I think it's important to have a meta appreciation for one's own skills and what one brings to the table. There was an interview with the chef Alton Brown on a show, The Big Idea, with Donnie Deutsch, that appeared, I think, sometime in the late 2000s, when that show was still a thing. I don't know if it is. And Alton Brown said, ultimately you're selling yourself as a product. And the analogy that I use is to find the sharpest arrow in one's quiver and to use that over and over again, because life is short, and we're not going to solve every problem. We're not going to learn every skill, but what we can do is kind of, train our phaser fire on the weakest part in the Borg cube and make some headway there. In my case, I would say that having a good broad literacy of science and technology, along with an appreciation for how one must work with others and how working with others generates ideas, is sort of my sharpest arrow. I think the ability to communicate with individuals in the group, not just what is their next experiment going to be, but how are they going to manage their time to get through a period in their life where they, they're not making a lot of money. They live in a too hot apartment that where air conditioning is literally banned. They may be very insecure. This is probably the most asymmetric power dynamic they're ever likely to experience. The grad student PI relationship. I try to be as empathetic and gentle as I can with that relationship, because I know how tenuous it is from the standpoint of the student. So I would say that being able to identify one's one's skills outside of the technical realm are, indeed the sort of the inverse or complement of what one would normally consider from the outside to be important in an engineering or basic science lab.
Yeah, I often feel like scientists in my field or in many other fields almost exemplify kind of this inverse of the Peter principle of you basically rise to the level of your incompetence. I think where scientists do is that they're assumed to be so brilliant, and engineers too, just the raw intellectual horsepower, as we say, that they can do anything. And that includes being a leader, being a PI, being a professor. I mean, I never received any training in being a professor. In fact, some of the best education I had was with when I was preparing to become a certified flight instructor. And there you learn about the actual needs of the student, not just how brilliant the instructor needs to be, but also the needs of Maslow's hierarchy. I know that's somewhat outdated nowadays, but there are versions of it. But I note that I was never taught that. I was never taught here's how you become a professor. It was assumed that because I'm so brilliant, allegedly, that I'll be good at teaching. But really, the skills could not be more different. And sometimes the most educated, most intelligent sometimes they make the worst teachers.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
It's actually the last sort of valley of death in the academic progression, where one stage looks nothing like the stage before it. And the first one occurs between high school and undergrad. And the first thing that I noticed is that once you start in college, people, your TAs and your instructors are, they're not viewing you as a number, but they're kind of viewing you as a number and a position on the bell curve, for exam scores or whatever. The next level up between undergraduate and graduate education, the modalities of training look nothing alike. And I think some degree of merging the way we teach undergraduates with the way we teach graduate students would probably end up benefiting both education at the bachelor's and PhD level. And then, where it's completely coursework based, and then it's completely experiential in graduate school. And yet, you're still paying tuition, or your advisor is paying your right. tuition, or whatever we call tuition, to make it not tuition, because it's illegal.
Fees.
Right, exactly. And then the last transition between either PhD or postdoc, and then becoming, a lab director. And that's not necessarily just in academia, but that could be any number of industrial positions as well. There's no similarity whatsoever beyond, the 2 hours per day that you actually get to apply to actual research, or to think about formulation of
and just in terms of the job market, I mean, where else? I would say, like, imagine if it was like incredibly easy to play AAA baseball. Again, wearing my Padres jersey. Imagine, like, anybody could do it. I could do it. I can't even throw a pitch more than 20 miles an hour probably. But let's just say Brian Keating could be starting pitcher on, like, what's the name of our local AAA team? Anyway, there's a team up in Temecula. It's like the Padres farm team. But imagine if it was super easy for me to get that job. And then imagine if it was basically impossible to become a Major League Baseball player. Like, you go from being, basically a buyer's market, where it's very easy for me to get a job as as a pitcher or whatever in AAA, and the very next level on the academic rung is almost forbidden nowadays. I mean, I just had a postdoc get a very prestigious professorship offer from a top school in the UC system. I'm not going to name him because he hasn't announced it officially, and I don't want to
congratulations
cramp his or her chances at actually negotiating for the highest possible startup. But it's quite, and it was like, it made my day. I mean, when I heard that, I was like, I knew that there were 400 other applicants to this job. And in no other place is, I call it the academic Hunger Games. Like, you compete at all these different levels, or all these gatekeepers, and the rules of the game change at every level. And it's so hard to keep things straight as to, by what rules, what organizing principles, symmetry principles shall I devote my energies as an undergraduate versus a graduate student? Because you're right, if it looks very different. The modalities of pedagogy are different. I thought graduate school would just be a harder version of undergrad. You know, the homework problems would be hard. I knew that, you know, as an undergrad, there were problems I couldn't answer because I just wasn't as smart as my other, you know, classmates. But I knew that they could get it and somebody could get it. But graduate school, you don't even know the question, let alone the answer most of the time. And that level of uncertainty drives the human mind kind of a little bit to distraction and may cause actual harm, I think, emotionally, that academics suffer from higher rates of depression and even suicide. I speak about that a little bit in my book, Losing the Nobel Prize. One of my mentors as a postdoc committed suicide, and he was, you know, top notch of his field at Caltech, always perennially shortlisted to win a Nobel Prize in physics for great discoveries that he made.
Yeah.
And yet no one will ever know why he did such a thing. But actually, ironically, his wife or ex-wife, Frances Arnold, won the Nobel Prize in chemistry just a few years ago. And I'm wondering, like, do you see this, that your mission in part, at least, is to benefit the mental health of our very cherished students?
Absolutely. And I frequently get emails from students thanking me for the material that I post. I have one particular talk on the word unconventional is in scare quotes, unconventional careers for PhDs. And they're called unconventional by, you know, people like us because a career outside of academia for a PhD is
Right.
considered unconventional, even though that's 95% of PhD holders. And the system is the way that the reason this pyramid scheme kind of exists is because of the funding structure. We don't call the $30 billion NIH budget as an educational, you know, as primarily consisting of educational grants, but really that's what it is. The vast majority of the 30 billion from NIH or the 7.5 or whatever it is billion from NSF, most of that is going toward training of graduate students. And we call them research grants, but really it's, you know, they're educational grants. And we don't do a great job at preparing PhDs for the positions that are actually open to them, at least, you know, by the arithmetic. There are just so many fantastic PhD researchers who are not going to be employed as tenure track professors. And what we need to do is bring in people from industry and consulting and policy and government and show them the, you know, if we're going to keep the funding structure the way it is, we have to find a way to open the doors to positions outside of academia and perhaps outside of STEM-focused industry as well, because these are very important jobs being done by extremely smart, hardworking, impactful individuals, and the exposure to those worlds is not good at a university. My wife is a good example. She has the same academic pedigree that I do. She worked for a number of startups after finishing her postdoc at Stanford. She did her MBA at the Rady School of Management at UCSD and is now working in biotech. And I would say making a real difference on the COVID response. Actually works for one of the companies that has one of the largest market shares of COVID testing in the U.S. So this is a way that somebody who you know, who's working on the business side of a technology or of a biotechnology company is making a much bigger impact, frankly, than I ever will in my, you know, just in the last 3 months, the impact has been bigger. But who even knows, you know, what upstream marketing is? We don't teach that we think it's, you know, advertising. Upstream marketing must be.
I teach my students multi-level marketing so I can make a profit. But
exactly. Yeah, or like upscale marketing. Oh, so it's like a Super Bowl ad. No, it's nothing like that.
No. Yeah, I had a conversation with the patron of the Simons Observatory, Jim Simons, who's had success in 3 widely disparate fields, from pure mathematics to running one of the world's largest hedge funds, to running one of the world's largest philanthropic organizations dedicated to pure, not applied research. And he said, one of the most important attributes of a good scientist is to be a salesman, not in the, sleazy, cloying, kind of way well, I won't say used car salesman because some of them are friends of mine, but you get the idea. The stereotype is certainly has some wide applicability, but it is a skill that is incredibly underappreciated and actually, this is a part of my philosophy in the way I run my group with my colleague, Professor Cam Arnold, is we mandate that our students spend a certain amount of time outside their own discipline, learning about other branches, not of, engineering necessarily, although that's very important, obviously, for what we do on a practical basis, but actually to understand, controversies in other branches of astronomy that are totally unrelated to the cosmology, to the origin of the universe that we do for our day-to-day activities. And even within cosmology, to explore alternatives, not wacky things, but to explore like the 10 reasons you should not believe in the Big Bang, just for example, because I think it sharpens the mind to really be able to, as we say, you should know what to say to a heretic in in whatever religion or cult you're a member of, and in this case, there's reasons to that benefit the mind by going against the grain of the traditional orthodoxy, and I think that's emblematic, exactly as you said. We call it unconventional, but really those are the dominant, kind of attributes and skill sets, and we just don't teach them because we're interested in making these, mushroom spore clones of ourselves, and because I think to give ourselves some leeway, we don't get taught it ourselves, and there's an old saying in psychiatry that I learned from, Dr. Judson Brewer, and that's, victims victimize victims, or basically we are the byproduct of the system. So it's going to take people like yourself to kind of break the mold that, look, these are equally, maybe even more important. And just to say that is so shocking. The problem, of course, is that our elder colleagues might not, who are the gatekeepers of our advancement. And we should point out, advancement doesn't stop when you're, merely, when you become a professor, right? In some ways it begins, and it begins anew, the academic Hunger Games. We're running a little bit long on time. I want to respect your schedule. I do want to just touch base on one thing that I'm just very curious about you, and then we'll schedule for the next episode if you'll come back on the podcast, or maybe we'll time it for a couple of weeks from now. I want to talk about your article in Cell about coping and dealing with remote education using during COVID, and your tools and tactics, because it looks like we're going to be in for a long ride with COVID, unfortunately. And then I want to ask you some of the questions I ask of all my guests. These are kind of big picture, looking deep into the future, billions of years, and then looking deep into the past, advice to your former self. So we'll leave that as a teaser for everybody for part 2. Darren, will you come back on a part 2?
I'd love to.
So let me just conclude with a question that I'm just very curious about. If you had to teach, you had a billboard or whatever, and you could teach the most important thing in your field, in either chemistry, chemical engineering, nanoengineering, what would that thing be? What is the most fundamental result of nanoengineering? I remember reading about this, a book, Nanocosm. What the heck is the guy's name? You know what I'm talking about, right? This is the first popularization of nanotechnology.
I'm thinking of Prey by Michael Crichton, of Engines of Creation by Drexler. Drexler wrote Nanocosm too. Yep, that's right. So these are 20, 30-year-old works, right? What is the most important thing that you wish every human being that you meet, you just want to shake them? What's the most important thing in nanoengineering? I have an answer. It's a bit more of an ensemble answer than a nanoscopic answer, but it's something that really struck me recently, and that's the importance of energy dissipation at the very small scale. So people think that the reason that tape sticks to walls is because you have very, intimate van der Waals adhesion between the glue molecules, which is really just a low glass transition temperature polymer, attached to the porous surface. But really what you're doing is you're routing. The goal of engineering an adhesive is to route as much of the mechanical work as possible into molecular bond deformation so that it goes there instead of separating the interface with the material. Okay, so that's a bit of a boring thing, but dissipation.
I'll remember that next time I put a Band-Aid on one of my kids.
So dissipation is not always like a bad thing, like friction. Friction if there was no energy dissipation in the earth and the interaction between the soles of your shoes and the earth, you would just take one step and then circle the globe, right? So dissipation in engineering is one of the most important aspects of engineering science that we don't teach explicitly. You know, we teach conservation of energy and the first law of thermodynamics, but we don't say, look, this is really important. It has really bad and really fantastic applications or consequences. So, you know where all of your energy is going and engineer for your energy to go where you want it to go.
Fantastic. Yes, again, I'll tell that to my kids. When you're not letting enough dissipation to take place at the molecular level, Sonny. Well, Darren, this has been so much fun. We might need to have our own series, multiple lectures. I want to point people, just while we have the time now, to your podcast, Molecular Podcasting. Also your YouTube channel, Darren Lipomi. That's Darren with 2 R's. EN and then LIPOMI for those of you listening. It's really worth your time, even if you're not a scientist. You can replace succeeding in scientific research in this playlist with anything that you do. It could be business, management, anything where there's a responsibility, a duty to communicate complex ideas in a quantitative realm. That will benefit you. So I think I'm encouraging my listeners, my audience, to go out there and do that. Look into Darren's research. He does such fascinating stuff. It's too bad we didn't get to do the Kyoto Prize ceremony stuff together this year, but hopefully it'll be back on at some point in the future. And as I said, I will really want to go over this wonderful piece that you put in the journal Cell. Not too long ago, when I thought COVID would be a passing fancy. now it looks like
Trends in Chemistry, published by Cell, but just
to
give them their due. Yeah,
that's right. So I'll have a link to that in the notes in the YouTube video. And Darren, this has been such a pleasure. I hope you have a restful rest of your week, and I hope we can catch up again maybe sometime in a couple of weeks.
I hope so too, and we'll certainly make it happen. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Darren.